Hello students. In the previous lecture, we discussed about the key goals and methods of power balancing in international relations. In this lecture, we will evaluate balance of power as a theory in international relations, especially how its application and effectiveness in the post-Cold War period have been challenged by shifts in the global power dynamics, the emergence of new security threats, and evolving norms and institutions in international relations. We will proceed with the following outline. First, we will evaluate the relevance of balance of power theory in international relations, especially in the post-Cold War period. Then we will end our discussion with some concluding remarks. Edward Rhodes, who is also an important scholar of international relations, he urges the field of international relations to abandon rather than hopelessly attempting to rehabilitate the balance of power metaphor and also the logic that flows from it. So the point is, according to Rhodes, there is no point in rehabilitating the whole theory of balance of power or reviving the concept of balance of power, because the situation has changed. So the logic of balance of power is also changed. There is also another argument that today nuclear arsenals assure great powers the ultimate kind of invulnerability of their sovereignty. So now nuclear weapons are there, so great powers are not threatened of their survival, threatened of their security because of balance of terror factor or the deterrence of the nuclear weapons. So the point is, these things we have to take into account or we have to consider. So the great powers, they have got a kind of security through nuclear weapons, and for that they are not unnecessarily worried about their security. Another criticism against the whole notion of balance of power is that you can understand that in the way that almost all major powers in the world, they possess nuclear weapons, and the possession of these nuclear weapons made their security something permanent, that they are not worried about their security, they are not worried about their survival, unlike other countries, those who don't possess nuclear weapons. So in a way, the possession of nuclear weapons by the great powers, it made them not to think much about their survival, the balance of power, how to maintain balance of power, this and that. So the possession of nuclear weapons by the major powers, particularly the P5 countries of the United Nations Security Council, countries like India, Pakistan, North Korea, or to some extent Israel, so they are not worried about their day-to-day security. Rather, if any great power threaten their security, they can use nuclear weapons against that particular country. So here the balance of terror, or what you can say, the nuclear deterrence factor is greatly helping them, and in a way it maintains the operation of balance of power in that particular arena. So the point is, nuclear factor has definitely changed the notion of the balance of power or the operation of balance of power. Moreover, war among the great powers in the present day is also unthinkable, because it cannot resolve their disputes. We have seen that in case of Russia and Ukraine, that Russia attempted to attain its war objectives by attacking Ukraine, but it has miserably failed because the war is still continuing, and even Russians never imagined that the war will continue for such a long period of time. So ultimately what will happen is that both the parties will come to the negotiating table and resolve their differences. So now the period of taking recourse to war or using war as a means or as a statecraft is not there. The same could also be cited about China and India. Both the countries possess nuclear weapons, and even if there is a geographical differences or there are territorial differences between these two countries, but they will never recourse to war, because both the countries know that this is not going to solve their problem. They ultimately have to sit, they have to negotiate and resolve their dispute. So the point is, balance of power as a mechanism, as a tool for resolving the great power disputes or operating in a way that will control the power distribution at a particular time, these has all become outdated. So because the whole concept of war has become unthinkable now among the great powers. So naturally the whole notion of balance of power system has also become outdated. There is also another criticism against the notion of balance of power, because it is a theory deeply rooted in a territorial view of the wealth and security, a world that no longer exists. So you thought of balance of power in a world, in a situation when the countries were fighting against each other for territorial conquest or wealth and security. But nowadays, although you are interested for security, for wealth, but the concept of territorial conquest has gone with the end of the Second World War. The point is, because we are operating in a different world, so you don't need the earlier kind of balance of power. Rather, as many critics suggest, that we should think of new concept of international politics that would be ensuring more and more peace, not only among the great powers but also among different nations of the world. Others argue that balance of power cannot be the basis for international peace and security, because it failed to prevent two world wars and numerous other major and minor wars in the world. So other critics particularly highlight this aspect, that if balance of power is such a successful mechanism, such a successful tool, then how come it became possible that there were two major wars and there were so many proxy wars. So that explains that balance of power is not a successful strategy, or it is not a successful theory. Balance of power politics often leads to unnecessary wars and to the unnecessary extension of war. So there is another criticism that balance of power theory, it unnecessarily globalizes a local war, or what you can see, a local problem can be easily a global problem through the theory of balance of power. So that means there are serious problems with the whole notion of balance of power. Similarly, one of the great difficulties of evaluating the balance of power in the 21st century is that power resources are unevenly distributed among the great powers, and also there is no simple correspondence between the possession of resource and the ability to control the outcomes as a consequence. And so even if you may be powerful, you may be a great power, but you do not have control over the outcome of a particular situation. So you may be a great power, but you do not have control over outcome of a particular situation. So the main logic is, all the resources of the world are unevenly distributed among the small powers, among the medium powers, among the great powers. So even if you have the power of geography, if you have a larger geographical size, if you have a larger population, or even if you are technologically advanced, that does not guarantee you to control the whole situation or the outcome of a particular situation. For example, while the United States is overwhelmingly dominant in terms of military power, economic power is still evenly distributed between the United States, China, India, Western Europe, and even Japan. So the point is, militarily, America may be the preeminent power, but economically there are so many other powers, like China, like India, like Japan, or many other countries. So under these circumstances, it is very difficult to think of balance of power, because all the powers or all the resources that adds to your power is not evenly distributed. Other scholars find a problem between balance of power and polarity in international relations. So the problem of balance of power is that you have military power concentrated in few countries, but if you think of economic power, it is evenly distributed over so many countries like Germany, like Japan, like United Europe, maybe India, China, there are so many countries, those who are economically powerful, and many countries are also emerging as economic powerhouses like Indonesia, like Brazil, like many other countries. So the point is, because the resources are not evenly distributed, so that may create the problem when you think of balance of power, because you are economically dependent on other powers are economically dependent on you, and when you have a good trade relationship between other countries, you can't think of balance of power or controlling their power, because you may fear the economic consequences or the consequences on trade relationship. Under multipolarity, threats are allegedly more difficult to evaluate, because there is always a tendency among the states to pass the buck and rely on others to balance against an emerging state. So, because in a multipolar world there are so many great powers competing against each other, so if there is a problem of balance of power, so one or few states may pass the buck that this is not a problem for us. So, as you can see, when Ukraine issue was there, countries like India and China, they kept a distance from the issue because they thought it's a European problem. Let Europe resolve the issue or America resolve the issue. So, sometimes this kind of buck passing is there, and we have to consider this issue also while evaluating the whole concept of balance of power. On the other hand, when power is concentrated among one or two major powers that compete at the global level, then they are likely to export their rivalry abroad. So, basically I am talking about the two superpowers and their ideological rivalry during the Cold War period. So, when they have any problem at the global level, so what they were doing was they were exporting their rivalry abroad, unnecessarily interfering in other countries' affairs and staking a claim on those issues. For example, the United States and the former Soviet Union never fought a war directly with each other, but despite that there were almost 20 million people who died in the so-called third world, the superpowers intervened in a series of so-called proxy wars in the second half of the 20th century. So, if you look at the Cold War statistics, you will find that although the two superpowers, they never thought of a hot war, or they never fought a direct war against each other, but their interference in the developing world that was so costly for these countries that almost 20 million people died because of their proxy war. So, that shows that the tendency of the great powers to export their conflict, to export their problems to the other parts of the world. Refuting these arguments, both realist and the neo-realist, they contend that balance of power still drives the behavior of both allies and adversaries, although some of them agree that unipolarity is the least durable of all international power configuration and is being replaced by multipolarity, whereby the whole concept of balance of power is going to be relevant. So, some of the realist and neo-realist, they are of the view that unipolar world may not be a good order. The unipolar world may not be conducive for the successful operation of balance of power system, but the multipolar world is going to make the whole concept of balance of power relevant, or it is useful in international politics. Kenneth Walters, for instance, argues that a unipolar international system is not durable for two reasons. So, those realists who particularly think that unipolar world is not very conducive for balance of power system to operate, they give different arguments, and one of the main neo-realist, Kenneth Walters, so he had given two arguments against the balance of power system in the unipolar world. The first argument is that dominant powers take on too many tasks beyond their own borders and thus weakening themselves in the long run. So, the problem why balance of power system does not operate in a unipolar system according to Walters is that the dominant powers they sometimes take too many risks, and those risks actually weaken them in the long period of time. The other reason for the short duration of unipolarity according to Walters is that even a dominant power behaves with moderation, restraint and forbearance, weaker states will worry about its future behavior. So, if there is only one preeminent superpower, the weaker countries, they will always fear the superpower. So, the reason is, if there is only one preeminent power, then the other countries will always fear it, and because there is no countervailing power to check the remaining power, so that situation is not very conducive for the success of the balance of power system. Criticizing the liberal argument that a state's foreign policy is mostly shaped by its internal characteristics, such as its leaders' personalities, its political and economic system, or its ruling ideology, rather than by its external circumstances. Stephen Walt argues that if we believe shared values are a powerful unifying force, we are likely to overestimate the cohesion and durability of some of the existing alliances like NATO. So, if you give priority to the internal factor or internal character of the state as a reason for balance of power, then what explains the continuing relevance of NATO, the continuing functioning of NATO, what explains the countries like Finland and Sweden to become its member, or what explains why Ukraine is still interested in becoming a member of the NATO. So, it is not internal cohesion, it is not your internal factor, or it is not your internal characteristics, rather the external circumstances are very important for security consideration, and that is the reason why most of the realists, particularly Stephen Walton, argue that balance of power system will operate in a multipolar system and the military alliances will remain valid. Second, if we forget about the balance of power politics for a moment, we are likely to be surprised when other states and in some cases non-state actors join forces against a particular country. So, if you forget about balance of power at the moment or for some period of time, there may be a situation when other actors or even non-state actors they will join hands against you, and that may put you in a very surprising position. So in that circumstances you need balance of power to continue by investing in other countries, by investing in other countries' powers, also by increasing your own power. The US officials were, for example, surprised when Iran and Syria joined forces to help the Iraqi insurgency following the US invasion. So countries like Iran, countries like Syria who had not good relationship with Iraq, when the USA attacked Iraq, so these two countries they were not having good relationship with Iraq, but still they joined hands with the forces in Iraq opposing the US military invasion. So that shows that it's a different kind of world where you can't take anything for granted. Third, focusing on political or ideological affinities and ignoring the role of the shared threats encourages states to see their adversaries as more unified than they really are. So, if you just focus on political and ideological affinities between the countries rather than think about in balance of power terms, you are ignoring the role of shared threats, and then the adversaries will be in a position to create a unified problem for you. So, if you focus on the political or ideological affinities between your adversaries and ignore the role of shared threats, in that way you encourage those adversaries to be more unified than they really are. Although there may be some modest ideological common ground between Iran, Hezbollah, Houthis in Yemen, or Assad regime in Syria and the Sadr movement in Iraq, each of these groups has its own interests and agendas, and their collaboration is best understood as a strategic alliance rather than a cohesive or unified ideological front. So, according to Walt, ideological common ground may be one of the factors, but it is not the only factors that that can explain the unified rule of the countries like Iran. So, there may be some common ideological ground between different forces like Iran, Hezbollah, Houthis in Yemen, or the Assad regime in Syria, but the issue is they have their own interests, they have their own agendas, not just ideological common ground. It may be one of the reasons for their unification, but that is not the only reason, and in that circumstances there is a need for understanding the role of balance of power to get it operational in a regional context, so that it is able to maintain strategic stability in that particular arena. So, Walters particularly emphasizes the importance of balance of power not just at the global level, but also at the regional level. So, now let us conclude our discussion on balance of power with some important points. The realists similarly argue that despite globalization, the nation state has retained important powers such as the control over nuclear weapons, their legitimate use, the sole right to tax its citizens, and so many and so forth. Thus, it is the military power of the state which is more important in conditioning international politics rather than economic globalization. The realists point out that globalization may have brought the countries together, it has integrated themselves, it has led to more and more interdependence among each other, but so long as states are there, the importance of military power would be there, and that in a way will condition the working of international politics rather than economic globalization. So long as the sovereign state system remains the central pillar of world politics, and as long as power politics dominates the international scene, the realist concept of balance of power will continues to be relevant. So the realist argument is that so long as sovereign state system is there, so long as power politics is there, so long as the element of security, survival dominates the international agenda, the realist concept of balance of power will continue to be relevant. Another factors that makes power balancing relevant even today is the ideological rivalry, especially among the great powers such as the containment of communism and the expansion of liberal zone of peace will always remain the primary foreign policy goals of the United States and its liberal democratic allies. So long as communism is there, so long as nation states are there, so long as ideological rivalry is there, so long as nations give priority to their security and survival, the whole concept of balance of power will remain valid and applicable for international politics. In this sense, the balance of power will continue to be relevant for a long period of time to come. The Russia-Ukraine war clearly proves this concept. On the one side you have Russia, on the other side you have Ukraine, and Russia is an authoritarian country, Ukraine is considered as a democratic country, and in the NATO countries, the European countries, the United States, they have all joined hands with Ukraine, and China is with Russia. So the point is this system is operating in such a way that Russia, which earlier expected a quick result from the war, is still fighting a war, and there is nobody knows what will be the end result of the war. But one thing is clear, when one powerful country attacks the other country, would support the weaker side to maintain the balance of power situation. So that is clearly explained in the Russia-Ukraine war. Let us end our discussion with some important points. The debate between the supporters and opponents of particular balance of power system is inconclusive for two main reasons. First, the distribution of power among the states is a variable located at a structural level of analysis. Its relationship to outcome at the level of relations among the states has to be determined in the light of the character of the great powers and their particular relationship. So the problem is, when we are talking of the distribution of power among the states, so it may be a variable at the structural level of analysis as the neo-realists are talking about. But what is the level of its outcome on the interstate relations, particularly that has to be decided in the light of the character of great powers and their particular kind of relationship. So as the neo-realists are arguing, distribution of power among the states is a variable located at the structural level of analysis. The anarchical structure of the nature talks about the distribution of power among the states, but what is its outcome on the great power relationship, that is not properly explained by the balance of power theory. Second, since the origin of the modern state system in the 17th century, there are few cases of different systems across which one can make meaningful comparisons. So on the basis of the Cold War only, we can't judge the utility of balance of power, because that only provides a limited historical analysis or limited time to evaluate an important concept like balance of power. The balance of power is a dynamic concept which in practice has to be understood in that context. For example, it is too difficult to draw meaningful conclusions of the working of the balance of power system during the Cold War era, because there were many other factors that posed a different kind of challenges, and that may be because of nuclear factor, maybe some other reasons. So we cannot draw important conclusions only from the limited history of the Cold War period, or maybe the period what is called the perpetual peace period, from 1814 to 1914. Rather, there are many factors that explain the kind of balance of power situation at that particular period. So, it is not just the distribution of power, rather it may be possible that the balance of terror factor was one of the major reasons for political stability in that period of time. So, on this basis we cannot claim that balance of power as a concept, as a theory operates at the global level, but it may be possible that as the case of Russia and Ukraine proved, that it may operate successfully in a local context or in a regional context. So, the point is we have to understand this, that there are so many dynamics involved in the operation of the balance of power system, not just the global anarchy or the security and survival issues as highlighted by the neo-realist. So, thank you for your patient hearing. We will start with a new concept of international relations in the next lecture. Thank you very much.